Hello and welcome to Farmland. Later on today's programme, I'll be discussing the impact of recent world events and financial pressures on farm families with Chair of the Irish Farmers Association Farm, Family and Social Affairs Committee, Alice Doyle. But first, I'm joined in studio by the Executive Director of the Farm Tractor and Machinery Trade Association, Michael Farrelly, and Agriland journalist Richard Halleron to discuss how the machinery world is weathering global and economic events and what is the best way to prevent a pressure point at the back end of the year in terms of feeding livestock. Michael, thank you for joining us. I'll first go to you. In terms of the machinery trade at the moment, obviously the whole world is experiencing inflation, pressures on finances at the minute. How would you see the machinery trade going at the moment?
Well, it's, a story with two sides to it. On one side, this year, all the manufacturers have full, all their books are full with orders, and sales are performing very well on all elements of the machinery trade at the moment. Then on the other side, especially since the outbreak of war in Ukraine, you have a big problem with the rise in fuel costs. Because if you think about machinery manufacturing, fuel is used everywhere. So if you think of a machine and there's rubber on the tires, the cost of the process of vulcanization for tires, that uses huge amounts of energy. In a factory, you're transporting in your raw material, you're transporting out your completed goods. That's all fuel for the transport. In the factory itself, you're using ovens to bake paint. In the production of all the components that go into it, like steel, that's obviously very heavy energy dependent. So at the moment, there are astronomical rises in fuel costs. And so the manufacturers are trying to deal with those, because the impact of that on all across the board. Sometimes traditionally you might have a rise in the price of rubber or the price of steel or the price of a single component. The problem now is that energy is causing everything to rise, so that's a concern going forward.
And do you think that will be reflected then in prices for machinery?
Yeah, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen there. The manufacturers are trying to control what's going on. A lot of them would have forward bought years in advance their steel supplies and their other supplies, But there's no doubt that it will result in price increases going forward, But on the other side of it, I suppose, because demand has been so strong for the last year, and through COVID with problems with supply chains and all of that, what happened was, especially for this year, is that all the manufacturers said, look, because of this, we need to really schedule our production very carefully. And so they said to the dealers, you have to put in your orders for machinery. So there would have been a lot of orders, I'd say more orders put in for machinery than ever before. So, there are lots of orders there with, that are both in dealers' yards and that are coming through and being scheduled through. So supply, that won't really be an issue this year, but certainly long term, if the energy prices remain so high, it's hard to predict what's going to happen there.
The ag contractors that you mentioned there, they're coming into their season now very, very shortly. If some haven't even already, they will be in the next few weeks doing the first cut of silage.
Yeah.
So in terms of any of them that have to renew machinery, or is there ways that this year that they could save money on that with different types of equipment or different technologies?
Yeah, well, the big challenge for the contractors this year is going to be diesel prices, obviously. And that's a big side. But certainly, in terms of saving money or providing a service to farmers that's better value, or helps the farmer reduce their input costs. There's lots of things that contractors can do there, so there's lots of new technology and equipment out there, some of it that's funded through the TAM's grants. So you have like your fertilizer spreaders with section control and that can control the rate, really accurately control the rate of fertilizer application. Guidance systems which make sure that whatever operation you're doing in a field, you're doing it in the most efficient way possible with zero overlap. And there's obviously knock-on savings there on fuel costs and stuff like that. Low emission slurry spreading. The technology now, we can talk about like dribble bars and and that kind of technology, but also where it can measure the nutrients in real time that's coming out of the quality of the slurry. So you can now, instead of going to spreading so many thousand gallons per acre, you're going to spreading so many units of nitrogen or so many units of phosphorus per hectare, and that can be completely controlled by the tractor and the slurry tanker, So certainly that kind of machinery can either save the contractor money with the guidance and making sure you're not overlapping, or for the farmer by helping them maximize and understand what their inputs are going in. There are other things as well, like technology on harvesters, both on forage harvesters and on wagons and on balers now, where they can actually measure the quality of the silage as it's being made. So that then allows the farmers plan forward and understand, directly after the crop is made, understand what's the quality of that, and then plan their fodder budget. What do we need to supplement that going forward, whether you're a beef farmer or a dairy farmer,
That's interesting there about the fodder, and I know it's something that you have touched on yourself in opinion pieces, Richard, particularly as we hit into the silage season, where you were discussing the potential problem that could arise in the back end when there isn't enough silage or there isn't enough high quality silage.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm hoping that farmers have gotten over the shock that fertilizer is, for nitrogen at least, 900 euros a tonne. I mean, that's a reality that we now have to live with. There is talk that quite a number of farmers are saying, we're not going to buy fertilizer, we're not going to make that much silage this year. Personally, I think that's very short-term thinking. The reality is that if we don't grow the grass, if we don't produce the silage, we could be looking at a real fodder crisis, I believe, the back end into the winter of 2022, into the early months of 2023. And I truly believe that's the last thing we as a farming industry need.
And Richard, I know that, I suppose some of the feedback we would have gotten to your article in terms of potentially being a fodder crisis, and that it could be one of farmers' own making, was that farmers were saying it's not of our own making. We can't control world events, we can't control the cost of fertilizer. What can they control?
Okay, well, is it of farmers' own making or not? I'm old enough to remember years like 1985 when it started raining, I think the second week in May, and it didn't stop raining until St. Patrick's Day of the following year. And that was a weather-related crisis. Farmers had no control over that. They had to respond. And you heard Michael mention, I mean, farmers are used to dealing with crises, challenges, problems. I think 2018, 4 years ago, we had the drought. We had a polar opposite weather impact, but it was still a crisis or a challenge produced for farmers that they had no direct control over. Farmers do not control the weather. They have to work around it. The point that I would make is if farmers don't buy fertilizer today to produce the silage that they will need later this year, autumn into the winter, they're taking a conscious decision now not to produce fodder. So it is, in truth, of their own making, in my opinion. The other factor that comes into play here is if we're looking at very high feed costs, grain, oilseeds, compound feed costs next autumn into the next winter, if we're looking at the possibility of that being combined with grain feeds being rationed, then what do we do? Where do we go? I mean, my view very clearly is that fertilizer at 900 euros a tonne is still better value than having to pay goodness knows what for concentrate feeds next year. in terms of keeping a farm business going. Now, people will say, well, we'll sell the stock. If we don't have the fodder, we'll sell the stock. But the reality is, if there's not enough fodder in the country and dairy farmers start selling cull cows or young stock that they've kept over maybe a year and a half, then the market falls. It collapses. So to come back to another fundamental point, the farming organisations at the moment are pushing government very hard to come up with some form of scheme that will recognise the increased costs that all farmers, grassland farmers, tillage farmers, intensive livestock farmers are being confronted with at the moment. And if you look specifically at silage, my view would be if you don't make the crop in the first place, then there's nothing to fall back on in terms of being eligible for whatever scheme is coming down the track. So it could be short-term gain, short-term pain for a longer-term gain in terms of being eligible for whatever support schemes that could be coming down the track. But I think there's a fundamental message to be gotten out there, and that is grass and silage are our most cost-competitive feeds from a ruminant perspective. If we don't make them, we're in trouble, I believe.
I just add to that as well. Like, I think there are options out there for farmers. Like, so for example, a lot of beef farmers aren't as focused on making as good a quality silage as they could. But, if they cut silage earlier and ted it out and then bale it, they'll reduce, rather than just baling directly after the moor, they'll reduce their bale volume by about 25%. So there's a saving there in terms of the number of bales that they have to make without compromising on the quality of the feed that they have. It's all about the dry matter value in the feed. There are other things as well, like as Richard said, they need to make the silage. So, but there are other options out there. So, for example, even with prices at 900 euros a tonne for nitrogen, if you go and make your silage using a forage wagon instead of the traditional harvester, you could potentially save the cost of the fertilizer, even with the high prices at the moment. So there are options out there available to farmers, but I completely agree with Richard that, they need to make the fodder. The fodder, we don't want a fodder crisis in the country.
If farmers are looking at the option or thinking, oh, well, sure, the fella down the road will have a few bales, he'll have the, I can use the silage that he may not surplus. There may not be the surplus there. I think there's also another fundamental point to make, and that is every farmer in the country, we're coming to the end of the 2021-2022 feeding season. Cattle are out of grass now. Actually, the first thing you should be doing is actually looking at what silage you do have right now and factoring all of that in terms of your planning for the future. And I think if you're working with a contractor to make your silage in any year, now is the time to be chatting to the contractor, to work through a system, and Michael pointed to this or discussed some of the relevant issues there, in terms of getting value for money for your contractor. I mean, there are options. I mean, if you have a mower, you can pre-cut the grass for the contractor. If you've got the rake, you can be doing that. Another option is saying to the contractor, well, look, listen, we'll put the fuel in. So that's a cost that's coming directly out of your farm. You have total control over that. So there are options in terms of making all of this a lot more flexible for you. But I think the bottom line is walking away and saying, oh, the short-term issue is I'm not buying fertilizer to grow the grass in the first place is very short-sighted thinking.
In terms of the machinery that you mentioned there, and earlier you mentioned the TAM scheme, Michael, how appropriate or efficient of a scheme is that now? We'll say if people did want to invest in the different types of machinery that could have long-term savings for them.
Yeah, well, like there's significant funding out there for them. Like you're either your 40% or your 40% or your 60% grant, depending on if you're a young qualified farmer or not. And so, for example, on a fertilizer spreader, I think the maximum grant is up to a value of about €8,500. But that will get you into a top of the range, fertilizer spreader that can control the rate accurately and has got section control, and with and same with guidance systems. They're also covered under it. And the low emission slurry spreader, like your trailing shoe and your dribble bars, you know. And, you know, you also have to look at the costs, like in terms of the increased usage of the nutrients in the slurry, you know, and that it is a commodity, you know, a valuable commodity on your farm, and to be getting the maximum use out of it there, you know.
But there is some positive news as well in terms of, you said, you know, orders are in for machinery, and shows are coming back, which is, it's great to see, and, and the Farm Machinery Show is coming back. How has the feedback been from that so far?
It's been brilliant, like it, you know, and the point you made is people, you know, so looking forward to it, you know, and both within the industry and, you know, the guys wanting to go to a show, but also among the public. You know, there's been phenomenal demand. Like we're delighted, you know, because you're always nervous, you know, because it was 2019 since we had a show before, since we had our last show because of the pandemic. We decided to move the date to the summer because just, you know, it was the best chance of running a safe and a show that was safe for everybody in terms of COVID and all of that. And, you know, but we're delighted to see the strength of the support from all the manufacturers. Like all the major manufacturers are all attending the show. Your John Deere, you know, your Pottinger, your Lemkin, your New Holland, Case International, Class, all the Agco brands, JCB, you know, the list goes on and on and on. You know, it's brilliant to see it. And there's great excitement, there's great buzz about it.
Is there optimism in the industry there, or do you feel there's a wariness among particularly the big manufacturers?
Yeah, look, there's no denying the energy crisis at the moment is, you know, is concerning. But on the other side of it, you know, you came off like a fantastic year last year, which was the highest number of tractor registrations in many years, 2,400 new tractors registered. That was the highest figure since 2008. This year, you know, the figures to the end of March appear to be slightly back on last year, but that's more about the supply coming in because, you know, it's based on registration. So, you know, you're going to look at a similar number of tractors sold this year. As I said, all the order books are full. And then, you know, in terms of the dealerships and all of that, like they're having a very strong year this year because, you know, the contractors, the farmers, all their customers are saying, right, well, you know, whatever prices are like now, you know, looking to the future, there is only one way that the prices are going to go up. So that's driving demand for all the machinery that's there, you know, and there is huge, like other things driving demand, like the low emissions slurry spreading and the grants and that. So, you know, there's very strong demand for slurry tankers, for example, you know, and all of that. So, you know, the mood is generally very, very good out there and very, very positive at the moment. You know, and like when I came into this role as well, like the entire sector, it's a great sector. You know, if you take like the dealerships and all the indigenous Irish manufacturers, you know, like your Abbeys, your McHale's, you know, all Dramone Engineering, Cross Engineering, these are fantastic companies in based in rural Ireland and driving the rural economy. I like to say it's the backbone of the rural economy. But there is great positivity out there. There is a bit of a concern about the fuel price because that fuel or energy prices, that affects everything. You know, it's putting pressure on wages, it's putting pressure on inputs, it affects everything. But generally, I think there's a very positive, you know, things are going well in the industry at the moment.
Richard, thank you very much for joining us, and Michael Farrelly from FTMTA, thank you very much for joining us on Farmland today.
You're welcome.
I'm joined now by Alice Doyle, the Farm Family Chair with the IFA. Alice, thank you very much for joining us on Farmland today. I suppose the first thing that we want to talk about is the pressure that's currently on farm families at the moment. And I suppose you're part of a farm family yourself. You know more than most how it's affecting people, the rising cost of inputs, inflation, the pressures that are coming on farm families in terms of climate action. But let's start about input costs first, which are a immediate concern. I suppose the silage season is coming up. What are you hearing back from farm families?
That is a huge stressor at the moment. You know, we talk about anxiety among people, and what is anxiety? It's the unknown. It's the concern about the unknown and lack of control over what's happening. And certainly in the whole area of inputs, that in the last 6 months in particular, it has created a huge stress on farmers. The increase has been phenomenal. If we look at the different sectors, you know, the actual price increase in everything. I was just asking my husband, say, for example, last night we were looking at dockets that came in this time last year, and looking at, you know, a ton of, say, 10, 20, which would be a very common input for most farmers. And I just have in my hand here the docket that we used last night, and the docket last year said that that ton of 10, 20 would have cost €375. That today, 1 year exactly later, is costing €1,000. That is a 280% increase in 1 year on the most common of inputs. Another example would be, say, urea, protected urea, which last year was costing €395, is costing €1,100 today. So you can take that, and these are the most common inputs that every farmer is using. And can you just imagine, like, if everybody had to look at the input that they were putting in, whether it was making a loaf of bread in the morning, if you had a 300% increase in the price of flour or the price of buttermilk in the morning to make the loaf of bread for the kitchen table, the outrage there would be and the uproar there would be. Well, this is the situation that farmers are facing, that they have. That's just, I'm taking fertiliser. You take fuel. Fuel is up over 80%. This time last year, diesel was costing about 66 cents a litre for agricultural purposes. It's well over €1 today. So you're talking about over 80% of an increase. And these are basic essentials. These are needed for the day-to-day work of a farmer. If he doesn't have diesel, he can't run the tractor. He can't run the machinery to sow the crops. He can't cut silage in a couple of weeks' time. He can't harvest in the autumn time. And we're talking about thousands of litres of diesel being used every week. I spoke to a local contractor yesterday who would normally do our silage, for example, and I was just asking them, you know, give me an idea of the input costs that you have this year and the changes or whatever. And he said, like, my diesel, I'm talking about, he said, every day I could take in 4,000 litres of diesel into the yard. And if that's up 80%, look at the price, look at what he's being asked to put in. Now we have to pay for that as the farmer. He can only take a certain whack on that. He has to pay his way, and he's not going to keep working for charity, you know. So that's going to be now reflected in what we will pay to have our silage cut come in the next 2 or 3, well, it's 3 weeks' time, 4 weeks' time. We'll have to look at that, and that will be reflected in our output or our input costs there. And that is huge, because that's the farm, but that reflects back into the house. And I like to see that mentioned more, that the family suffers as the result of that, because if the extra money has to go into the yard to pay for the contractor to come in and cut the silage, well, it has to come from somewhere. And finance, as you mentioned earlier in your introduction, is an issue for farmers at the moment, the availability of it and the working capital. Because there's huge money required to buy this fertiliser, to buy inputs, they have to get working capital, and it's not as easy to get working capital anymore, because the margins are so small. The banks are not willing to give it, and we can understand to a certain extent why that is. But this is huge pressure, so therefore cutbacks have to be made everywhere.
And I suppose, Alice, the point that you make there is that these bills are coming in now. Your bill increased to over €1,000 from 300 odd this time last year for fertiliser. Mm-hmm. The extra cash has to be got. Now, commodities aren't the worst they've ever been. They're not too bad at the moment. We'll say dairy and beef prices aren't the worst. But I suppose what people don't understand is there's still a big difference between good commodity prices and the inflationary pressures that are on farmers at the moment. The commodity prices are not meeting the increase, I suppose, in the input costs.
We see, if you look back at the commodity prices pre this huge increase, say, in input costs, were barely meeting the cost of the input. So you were talking about the price of beef, around maybe €4, a little under €4 a kilo. And at that, farmers were finding it very hard to make ends meet with that. And that was the input costs at what they were a year ago. Now, can you imagine, input costs have increased 300%, but the price of beef hasn't increased 300%. So it is not matching it anywhere near where it should be matching. Same with all the other commodities, we can take all of them. The input costs are not matching, I should say the price at the end is not matching the input costs. So there's a huge difference there, and you can only compensate for a certain amount of time and draw on reserves. But the reserves run out, and the reserves haven't been there for a good few years in farming. So you're down to the negative regions now, where people just cannot meet those costs. They haven't got the reserves.
There's a financial strain there, and a very serious financial strain, where farm families have to come up with the money to pay bills at the moment. But I suppose another offshoot of that is the mental strain that puts on farm families as well, to have that financial pressure. Financial pressure for anyone in this world is a very serious pressure on people's well-being. How are farm families coping?
Yeah, well, farm families, just like every other family, whether you're farming or not, these pressures are now coming on people. The increase in the electricity bill, the gas bill, the oil bill for the house alone, forget the farm, the house alone, are all increasing. And the cost of living, you go into the supermarket, you can take, I digress a little bit here, but just to give you a lead into how it causes the impact. I can go into a supermarket as a farmer's wife now, and I go in and I look at the cost of my supermarket, my shopping list at the end of the week, and I see a huge increase already. Yet that's not reflected in the price that the farmer is getting at the other end, for his product. But the point I'm making there is that I now have to meet an extra grocery bill. My husband is meeting an extra bill out in the yard for his input costs. He has no guarantee whatsoever that the output at the end of the year, whether it's the harvest, that he'll get a good price for the harvest, that the cattle price will hold up for at the back end of the year, because we're produced cattle, we finished cattle. So we don't know that price is going to hold up. We don't know that his harvest will come in, the price will come in well. Will he even have a harvest? The weather could change. We all know the harvest depends on weather. So we have all these pressures coming, and you can just imagine what that does to a household, because you're constantly on edge, you're constantly worrying, you're trying to make ends meet, you're trying to predict what might happen, so you're predicting the unknown, this uncertainty that I mentioned at the beginning. You're dealing with an uncertainty, so you're trying to say, okay, in the event of this happening, can I meet this? In the event of that happening, what will I do? In the event of there being a reasonable harvest, reasonable price for cattle, yeah, I can just about make ends meet here. If it doesn't go, where do I go? What do I do then? From inside the house, I can say the same thing. And where there's families with young children in college, trying to pay fees, trying to pay education fees, and they're all increasing too, in the sense of, you say, for example, somebody who has a child or two in school, or maybe 3 in secondary school, or for primary school, secondary school, being bused to school. Bus prices are going to go up. But the bus people have told us that the fees for our children going to school on the buses are going to go up because the cost of fuel has gone up. Nobody thinks about that from a rural point of view. If you live in a town, you can walk to school, you can hop on a bus that doesn't cost you as much. In a rural environment, we pay huge fees to get our children transported to school in the local secondary school or local primary school. We have to meet that cost. We have to still pay electricity bills. We still have to pay oil bills to heat the house. And most farmers' houses are out in the rural areas. They're older houses. They're not as easily, they're not as modern as some of the town houses that are built now, that are airtight, and you don't have to worry about as much fuel. We still have the older type houses. To retrofit is going to cost us an absolute fortune if we need to do it, because they're older. And nobody thinks of all those. These are the stresses that are on farmers as well as everybody else, as well as the stress that's out in the yard. And I often think of any other business or industry that would have input costs increase as much as what they do for farmers, and the end price coming into them either hasn't gone up or has gone down in some cases, and is so dependent on so many other circumstances like weather conditions or whatever, how they would cope. I was a teacher, I was going to say in my past life, but I'm retired now, but I worked I was off farm and I worked on farm, and I saw the value of my income to the farm. You know, it allowed the farm to run because I could run the house on it. But I also think if in my profession, if we were told in the morning, you know, that that our salaries were going to go down hugely, and we were going to get less at the end of the day for our salary, we would have to work longer hours, and we were going to get less at the end of the day, there'd be uproar, as there would be in any profession or any other industry, except farming. Farming keep taking it on the chin and keep going and saying, because food has to be produced, people have to be fed, we'll do it. And we'll hope for the best. We live in hope.
And Alice, you mentioned there that you did have an off-farm job in teaching. Labour shortages are a problem across every sector at the moment. In terms of not being able to afford labour on farm now, you know, if particularly in busy periods, be it the calving period or the silage period, where maybe farmers would get a little extra help on farm, they can't afford to do that now. So they're trying to do it themselves. As you said, they're working longer hours, there's more pressure on them. But then there are cases now where even farmers have to go off farm and try and get some other form of income. So what is that doing to, you know, a sort of work-life balance there? Yeah,
and that comes back to a question you asked me a minute ago, which was about the stress on people and the mental stress and the physical stress. And there's both, there's physical and mental. The physical stress is that people, the farmers that are even working full-time on farm, because they've less labour, they're putting in more hours to get the same end that they would have got with less hours in the past. So they're putting in more hours. The big worry about somebody putting in more and more and more and more hours is that first you have the physical stress there, because the body can only take so much. That gives rise to a lot more near misses on farms. We don't often hear of the near misses. We hear of the serious accident where somebody, unfortunately, was a fatality, somebody was killed, or somebody had a very serious accident and lost a limb or whatever. But let's take the situation where we've an awful lot of near misses that are never recorded. And most of those near misses come from the fact that a farmer is wrecked. They have put in huge hours because they have nobody else to relieve them to do the work. So that's the physical strain. Then there is the mental strain on top of that, because if you're worn out physically, you won't make the decisions that you should be making with the same clarity that you would if you had your rest. So I think there's that double strain, and there is a shortage of labour for a number of reasons. I think the first reason is that an awful lot of young people do not want to come back into farming. They don't see an income in it for them. And the second side of it is farming cannot afford to pay them the salary or the wages that industry can pay them. And this, going forward for farming, is going to be a huge problem, because we will have an awful lot of people who want to farm but can't, because it isn't economically viable for them to do it. And, you know, I can take our own family and look at them and say, you know, they're all working in good jobs off the farm. Who wants to come back and work longer hours, not have your weekends guaranteed, not have your statutory holidays, and say, well, will I get as much from it as I'm getting from the salary I'm earning in the job I'm working in? And I think that is becoming a huge question now within farming. Where is the future of it going to be? Food is going to have to be produced, but it's going to have to be produced at a price that allows the farmer to have a life, because if he doesn't, they're not going to come back to do it. And then the question is, where is that food going to be produced? And is it going to be produced somewhere where it won't be as environmentally friendly as we have, where we have to look at, you know, we know that we contribute to emissions. We all know that. Everybody does. Every single person in this country contributes to the emissions, but farmers have been vilified, whereas as being the ones who you think we had destroyed the planet. We've been the ones who have been feeding the planet. And in Ireland, we feed it more environmentally friendly than anywhere. And I think that we need to give farmers a little bit of positivity and say, instead of feeding them all the negativity and vilifying them and saying, okay, we will do our best to try and comply and improve, you know, our contribution, or reduce our contribution, I should say, to emissions. But in the process, at least give us some credit for the fact that we are trying to do it in the most environmentally friendly place probably on this planet, and not be told that we're the ones, you know, you think in Ireland we were the only ones in the world that were destroying the planet, whereas we're probably one of the better countries in the world when it comes to providing food better environmental conditions. So I think from a mental point of view, some of that stress could be taken away if that kind of negativity wasn't being fed to farmers all the time, because they're saying we're doing our best to produce food and we're trying to do it in the best conditions possible, and we're doing it under all the scientific guidance we've been given for the last 40 years. Everything we've done for the last 40 years has been done under guidance, scientific guidance from our advisory bodies, which we were told was the right thing to do, produce, and this is how you produce more, and this is how you do it best. Now, because of European policy on the environment, we're being told, no, cut back, cut back. Everything you've been doing for the last 40 years has been so wrong, and you've destroyed the planet. Can you imagine what that does to a person's head?
Yeah.
And I think this is causing huge stress, as well as all the physical things of the common things like the finance, the physical, all of that. But this mental barrage, constant barrage of you're a vilifier, is not good either.
Finally, Alice, in terms of the pressure, financial, and I suppose which leads to mental pressure, but predominantly financial at the moment on many family farms, what supports are needed there? What can the government do? What would you say from a farm family perspective is the next thing that needs to happen?
The present financial situation, I think, there is arising from the fact of this short-term working capital, that it's not there, and how hard it is to get it. Like we've been talking to farmers who are saying, very hard to get a loan from the banks because they can't prove that they're going to have this income in, say, the harvest or later on in the year. Now, I can understand the banks are not going to throw money out at people, but I do think more consideration is going to have to be given to farmers when they come in, knowing the circumstances and knowing where we're at. And the lack of a face now. You're dealing with a computer, you ring, you're talking to a machine half the time. There's no understanding of the personal circumstances of where the farmer is. Now, I'm not expecting to throw it out there, willy-nilly and say everyone can have whatever, but I do think there has to be a certain amount of understanding and humanity put into this again, where there's a bit of human interaction, where people will understand and will look at everything you put in front. It's not just a computer ticking the boxes, because the computer doesn't have all the boxes. And sometimes by meeting, and in the past where a bank manager or assistant manager or whoever senior officer in the bank would meet a farmer, they would look at the circumstances and they would see all the circumstances, and they would see all the things that were contributing to it, and would see, that won't come up on paper and that won't tick a box on a computer program, but that's a real income there, or there's a possibility of an income there, or this is how we can change it to meet your repayment conditions. That doesn't all have to be met according to the computer box, which says it has to be met on the 31st of December 2022. Okay, we can stretch it a little bit because you're going to have something more in January, February, March time, and the human side considered. From a national point of view, I really do think and from it's not just national, it's European policy. In the long term, we're going to have to look at policy, and we're going to have to look at how policy is affecting farmers. Some reality is going to have to come into this. We're being told on one side, cut back on production for environmental reasons, and you come on the other hand and increase production because now there's a worry of a food shortage. Now, where's the logic in that? Any normal human being who's working with their full faculties will get confused when it comes to that, and that'll give rise to anxiety and frustration. So a little bit of reality and a little thinking has to come into this. And also, I think from a national perspective, from a national government perspective, I think we're going to have to look at, Ireland doesn't stop outside Ball's Bridge. Ireland only starts outside Ball's Bridge. There's a huge population out there who don't have transport at their public transport at their fingertips. They need diesel. They need four-wheel drives to pull a trailer to bring cattle to a factory or from the mart. They can't say, I'll buy an electric Jeep. Electric Jeep won't pull a trailer. That kind of reality is not there. We don't have those things at our fingertips. The reality is gone out of it. That we have costs in rural Ireland that are different to urban Ireland, and I don't want to make it urban versus rural either. But a certain amount of reality has to come into this. And farmers, by their nature, are resilient. They always have been. They've always dealt with weather changes and price changes, and they're by their nature resilient. But this is the first time in my lifetime, and I was there in the 80s, maybe a lot younger than I am now, and maybe not as aware of how bad things were for my parents, but when things were bad. But there was hope then, and there was a chance that you could see some light at the end of the tunnel. The difference now, I find, is that the farmers today can't see that hope. They don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. The only light they're seeing is the oncoming train, and they are worried about that. Food is going to have to be produced, and I think it is very short-sighted for both European policy and national policy if we're prepared to sacrifice our farmers who can produce it, both won't say economically, but somewhat economically, because we have grass grass ready available if we can afford to put the fertilizer on it. We have it there. We have very good environmental conditions, and we can produce it better and more environmentally friendly than any other country in the world, I think.
Alice, thank you very much for joining us on Farmland today.
You're very welcome, Stella. Thank you.
That's all from Farmland for this episode. Be sure to stay up to date with the latest agricultural news at agriland.ie or on the Agriland app. You can also follow us on social media at the following links.